Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. In this episode of our Energy and Infrastructure podcast series, we are talking about sustainable finance as it relates to the energy transition. I'm Edward Kempson, a partner in our Dubai office and the global coordinator of the firm's sustainable finance practice. Today, I'm joined by Chidi and Onyeche, a project development and finance associate in our London office.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
And Giulia Franzoso, a capital markets associate in our New York office.
Thank you, Ed. Happy to be here.
Both Chidi and Giulia have a wealth of knowledge in this space, and I look forward to a great discussion. So, to get started, Chidi, could you please briefly explain to us the nature of the energy transition?
Thanks, Ed. Happy to. So energy transition refers to the global energy sector's shift from fossil-based systems of energy production and consumption, including oil, natural gas and coal, to renewable energy sources like wind and solar, as well as lithium-ion batteries to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions to net zero by 2050.
Thanks very much, Chidi. So it's clear that huge amounts of finance will be required. But Giulia, why should that finance necessarily be sustainable?
Thank you, Ed. Yes, so a couple of things here. For energy transition projects, it often makes sense to consider sustainable finance either instead of or in addition to conventional financing. Because while it is true that higher interest rates and deteriorating global economic conditions have adversely impacted the sustainable finance market in 2022, the positive macro trend in the adoption of sustainable finance instruments is expected to continue in the years ahead, with global issuances of sustainable instruments expected to reach $3.8 billion per year in 2025. This is according to the Institute of International Finance. And in addition to that, over time, it is anticipated that demographics will prove to be fundamentally supportive of sustainable finance as younger generations, we know, tend to prioritize green and social considerations above financial return on investment. So it does make sense to consider sustainable finance in terms of demand, availability, and reputation. And we see that already in practice. We have seen and continue to see banks and financial institutions set ambitious sustainability targets. So many of them now are seeking green financing and investing opportunities, a phenomenon that has been described as a wall of green cash. And just to mention a few examples to illustrate this point, JP Morgan has committed to facilitating $200 billion in clean financing between 2016 and 2025, representing an annualized commitment of approximately $22.2 billion. Similarly, Bank of America committed to mobilizing an additional $300 billion through its environmental business initiative between 2020 and 2030, representing an annualized commitment of approximately $27.3 billion. Also, institutional investors, driven by their clients, have made sustainable finance commitments. They also need to find the green investment opportunities, and we see how they want to know more about the sustainable investment options available to them. In this context, we saw that investor demand has been driving sustainable fund growth, with assets under management nearly doubling to $255 billion in just 3 years. And asset managers globally are expected to increase their ESG-related assets under management to $33.9 trillion by 2026. With a projected compound annual growth rate of 12.9%, ESG assets are currently on pace to constitute 21.5% of the total global assets under management in less than 5 years. And finally, many issuers and borrowers believe that they can enhance their reputation by obtaining sustainable finance. They may also be able to achieve a commercial benefit in the form of better pricing, so-called greenium, an interest rate step down, oversubscriptions, broader investor base, and so on and so forth.
Thanks very much, Giulia. Perhaps just taking a step back, if you could explain what are the key requirements of sustainable finance? So what is sustainable finance?
Of course. Thank you, Ed. So sustainable finance in general is the practice of making investment decisions that take into account the ESG factors of a given economic activity or project, as well as making investment decisions that support certain ESG goals and outcomes. More in particular, if we look closer at the E and the S and the G of sustainable finance goals, environmental goals may include the mitigation of climate crisis or the deployment of sustainable resources and assets. Social goals usually include human and social rights and diversity, especially in the context of hiring practices. And governance goals refer to management, employee relations, and compensation practices. It should be noted that sustainable financing and ESG goals are commonly aligned with specific industry guidelines and regulation. Over time, we saw the development of different standards, each with its own specific requirements. The most common, of course, are the well-known ICMA Green Bonds Principles, the LMA Green Loan Principles, the CBI CBS, and the EU GBS. Issuers and borrowers should know these existing regulations and standards and should also carefully keep track of recent developments in the associated guidance. So now that we have defined sustainable finance in general, we should highlight a fundamental distinction here, which is the distinction between use of proceeds instruments and target-linked instruments. Use of proceeds instruments are specifically designed to raise capital for projects with a positive environmental and social impact. And the net proceeds are used to finance or refinance eligible projects or assets. A common example of use of proceeds instruments are green bonds and green loans, which are meant to raise capital for environmentally beneficial projects and are generally structured in accordance with voluntary industry guidelines, namely the Green Bond Principles and the Green Loan Principles. On the other hand, we have target-linked sustainable finance instruments, which are directly linked to specific sustainability targets, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions or increasing access to clean water. Sustainability-linked bonds, or SLBs, as we usually call them, are a very common example of this kind of instruments, which we at Latham actually know very well, and we recently prepared a number of articles dedicated specifically to SLBs. You can access those articles on our website if you'd like a more in-depth analysis of this instrument. But for purposes of this discussion, it is enough to say that SLBs are structured in accordance with the ICMA Sustainability-Linked Bond Principles, and they focus on the key performance indicators and the sustainability performance targets set by the issuer. So issuers of SLBs do not really need to have any green expenditure and can use the proceeds for general corporate purposes. As a result, SLBs tend to be more appealing than green bonds to issuers which are seeking to finance transition strategy, but do not have anticipated pure green expenditure sufficient to justify a public green bond.
Very interesting insight, Giulia. Thank you. Chidi, perhaps you could give a few examples of how you have seen sustainable finance used in the energy transition in the context of your practice.
Thanks, Ed. So a number of transactions have come to the market in the EV battery space, and sponsors are constructing lithium-ion battery gigafactories, and such construction is financed under the Green Loan Framework. Which raises the question, why are batteries important for energy transition? Transition into a greener future will focus on renewables. However, while renewable energy provides clean, sustainable power that emits little to no carbon emissions, its intermittency has long been an issue. Batteries are seen as an important source of power in the sustainable energy future, and they play an important role in the global transition to electrification of cars, buildings, and cities powered by renewables, which has been cited as one of the keys to decarbonizing the world and fighting climate change. In addition to providing energy storage for a range of electronic devices we use in our daily lives, lithium-ion batteries power electric vehicles, as well as both micro and macro energy grids. In electric cars, due to their superior performance, efficiency, and safety compared to conventional batteries, lithium-ion batteries have become the preferred battery for the majority of electric cars. As part of storage systems, batteries enable utilities and grid operators to maintain the dependability of the electrical system by filling out the gaps left by the variable output of wind, solar power plants, and preventing the waste of excess energy. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, battery systems can also upgrade mini-grids, facilitate self-consumption of rooftop solar power, and store electricity in electric vehicles. But the manufacture of such batteries is capital intensive and is reliant upon external investments to enable us to accelerate the transition to net zero emissions. To access the pool of financing dedicated to green loans in the energy transition, borrowers may seek to outline their approach towards green investments and ensure full alignment with their jurisdictions or the jurisdictions of their financier's taxonomy. And borrowers may also seek to address, mitigate, and solve for environmental and social risks in their supply chain, as well as minimizing emissions and promoting circularity through battery recycling.
Thank you, Chidi. Extremely interesting. Turning to you, Giulia, if I may, could you briefly summarize for us the key legal requirements and considerations that you are seeing on, for example, green loan transactions?
Sure, I'll be happy to. And to illustrate all these concepts that we are discussing, let's briefly run through some of the practical structuring considerations and key items that we had to address in connection with some of our recent green loans for solar projects, with the understanding, of course, that these considerations can be applied mutatis mutandis to other energy transition projects. So let's start with the analysis of the practical application in the loan documents of the four core components of the green loan principles, namely, number one, the use of proceeds, two, process for project evaluation and selection, three, management of proceeds, and four, reporting. So regarding the use of proceeds, as we have already mentioned, one of the main features of a green loan is that the borrower commits to use the funds raised exclusively to finance or refinance green projects. And it may sound obvious, but it is actually very important to pay close attention to the loan documentation to ensure that it is clearly stated how the proceeds from the loan can be used. So, for example, in our recent loans for solar projects, we didn't just make sure to specify that the proceeds could be used exclusively to finance a solar project in general, but we actually broke that down to specify that the proceeds could be used to make equity contributions to the project, as well as to finance certain costs, such as development costs, the construction cost, and other transaction costs. Transparency in the use of proceeds provisions is truly key to integrity, and it should go hand in hand with reporting provisions, which we will discuss shortly, in order to avoid greenwashing claims. Moving on to the second core component, the process for project evaluation and selection, it is important that the borrower communicates to its lenders its environmental sustainability objectives and how the relevant green project fits within such objectives and how it constitutes an eligible green project. Briefly, regarding the third component, the management of proceeds, the proceeds of the green loan should be segregated or otherwise tracked by the borrower in a proper manner in order to ensure such funds are indeed allocated to the relevant green project. Which brings us to actually the fourth core component, very important, reporting. The borrower should make and keep readily available up-to-date information on the use of proceeds. Such information should be renewed annually until the green loan is fully drawn. Accordingly, the loan documentation should provide for an annual report to be prepared by the borrower, that we often call proceeds allocation report, where the borrower lists the eligible green projects to which the green loan proceeds have been allocated, with a brief description of the projects, the amount allocated, and their expected or already achieved impact. So now that we have discussed these four core components, we should also know that borrowers may appoint an external review provider to assess the alignment of the green loan documentation with the four core components of the GLPs. This provides for the additional assurance from an independent and qualified expert. Also, I would like to mention that green loans may include the declassification events and related declassification provisions. These are provisions dealing with circumstances in which a loan ceases to be classified as a green loan. The idea here is to avoid greenwashing, and if declassification provisions are included in the loan documents, they are often subject to very detailed discussion, as borrowers tend to resist the concept of automatic declassification, and they do request at least a grace period or a consultation process to determine whether the issues can be resolved, which of course, as you may imagine, require careful consideration and often intense negotiation. One final point here to conclude about structuring agents. So a loan sustainability structuring agent, that we also call a sustainability coordinator at times, may be appointed on a syndicated loan transaction. And this role is typically, but not always, undertaken by one of the leading lenders on the green loan. Market practice has evolved rapidly over recent years, and there is still often significant variation in terms of the role and responsibilities of a sustainability coordinator across different transactions. But a sustainability coordinator usually does play a key and very helpful role in aligning the green loan terms to good market practice. And therefore, it is something that borrowers may want to consider in order to leverage the specific expertise of a sustainability coordinator.
Thanks, Giulia. And what kind of instruments and legal structures can be employed for the purpose of making sustainable finance available?
Sure. Well, the most common structures today do remain loans, revolving credit facilities, and bonds. Sustainable finance term loans and bonds can be either unsecured or secured. They can be project loans and project bonds. The bonds can be revenue-backed, corporate guaranteed bonds, asset-backed, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Chidi and Giulia, ever so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. It was great to be here.
And thank you to our listeners for checking out this episode of the Energy and Infrastructure podcast in our Connected with Latham series. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon where we will cover other topics in the evolving energy and infrastructure sector. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcast on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics on this podcast, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.